Monsters rarely hide in shadows anymore. They wear tailored suits, sipping champagne at high society galas. Vivian watched immortals sneer at Lysander, a quiet prince, tracing frantic patterns on cold marble. Everyone abandoned him. She stepped forward, offering a hand unknowingly, igniting a war that would shatter their ancient world. The grand ballroom of the Astor Estate in Newport, Rhode Island, was a dizzying display of modern wealth, masking ancient predatory power. Crystal chandeliers imported from a dismantled European opera house cast fractured prisms of light across the polished marble floors. To the human politicians and hedge fund billionaires in attendance, it was simply the exclusive social event of the decade. To the immortal elite, it was a court of judgment, a place to bare metaphorical fangs while sipping vintage Pinot Noir. Vivian Mercer sat straight-backed at the magnificent Concert Grand Steinway, nestled in the alcove. She was a 26-year-old classical pianist, hired for the evening, not just for her Juilliard-trained dexterity, but for her legendary discretion. She knew what her employers were. She had known ever since she was 19, when a prominent cellist in her symphony had casually bared elongated canines after a flawless concerto. Vivian's survival in this peripheral world relied on one strict rule: play the music, observe everything, say nothing. Tonight, however, her gaze was repeatedly drawn away from the sheet music and toward the far corner of the ballroom. There stood Lysander Valerius. He was the only son of King Alistair Valerius, the sovereign who ruled the East Coast immortal factions with an iron fist and a terrifyingly calm demeanor. Alistair was currently holding court near the grand fireplace, charming a tech CEO with a predatory smile. But his son, the heir to a centuries-old dynasty, was entirely alone. Lysander was breathtakingly striking, possessing the sharp, aristocratic jawline and pale, luminous skin characteristic of his lineage. Yet while the other immortals glided through the room with liquid, arrogant grace, Lysander stood rigidly by a velvet-draped window. He was completely out of sync with his environment. Vivian watched as Lysander's long, elegant fingers rapidly tapped against his thigh, a complex, repeating rhythm of 4 quick strikes, followed by 2 slow ones. Tap, 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 pause, tap, tap. He was rocking ever so slightly on the heels of his bespoke Italian leather shoes. His eyes, a striking shade of pale winter sky blue, were fixed intensely on the geometric patterns woven into the Persian rug beneath him, entirely avoiding the faces of the room's occupants. He wore a suit, tailored not for fashion, but for profound sensory accommodation. Vivian, whose younger brother was on the autism spectrum, recognized the signs instantly. Lysander's collar was visibly looser than societal norms dictated. His jacket was made of ultra-soft, brushed cashmere, lacking the stiff, starchy interlining that the other vampire lords favored. He was actively avoiding the brutal sensory assault of the gala. For a normal human with autism, a party of this magnitude could be overwhelming. For a vampire with inherently hyper-amplified senses, Vivian could only imagine the sheer, agonizing volume of the world. He was likely hearing the hum of the electricity in the walls, the microscopic friction of silk gowns rubbing against skin, and the overlapping, chaotic heartbeats of every human in the room. The immortal court did not possess empathy. They despised perceived weakness. "Look at the broken air," murmured Lord Dominic Rossi, a notoriously cruel vampire with slicked-back dark hair and a penchant for archaic violence. He didn't bother to lower his voice. With his immortal hearing, he knew Lysander could hear every syllable. Alistair's greatest shame. He has the mind of an infant, trapped in the body of an apex predator. "It's a tragedy," simpered Lady Cassandra, leaning against Dominic, her eyes glittering with malice. "They say he hasn't spoken a coherent sentence in 3 decades. What use is a prince who cannot even look his subjects in the eye without flinching?" Vivian's hands tightened on the piano keys, transitioning sharply into a heavier, darker movement of Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata. Her chest ached with a sudden furious indignation. She watched King Alistair shoot a pained, embarrassed glance toward his son, before deliberately turning his back, choosing to ignore the mockery to maintain his own stoic facade. He's abandoning him, Vivian realized. To save face, the king is letting the wolves tear at his own son. The tension peaked when Dominic Rossi, fueled by a mixture of boredom and cruelty, detached himself from his sycophants and sauntered directly toward Lysander's isolated corner. Vivian missed a note, a rare, glaring error, as her anxiety spiked. Prince Lysander. Dominic drawled his voice a mocking purr. He stepped aggressively into Lysander's personal space, intentionally violating the invisible boundary the prince had established. Enjoying the architecture? Or are the lights simply too bright for our fragile royalty tonight? Lysander's tapping intensified. Tap, 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 tap. His breathing hitched shallow and rapid. He shrank back against the heavy velvet drapes, his hands coming up to hover near his ears, a desperate, instinctual attempt to block out Dominic's booming, intrusive voice. Dominic laughed a harsh, grating sound. He deliberately reached out and snapped his fingers mere inches from Lysander's face. Lysander flinched violently. A low, distressed vocalization escaped his throat, a sound of pure, unadulterated sensory pain. He dropped the crystal water glass he had been clutching. It shattered against the marble floor with a piercing crash that echoed over the music. The entire ballroom fell silent. The conversations halted. The sneers widened. King Alistair froze his face, draining of whatever color it possessed, his expression caught between fury and profound humiliation. But he did not move to help his son. No one did. They simply stared at the autistic vampire prince as he covered his ears, sinking slowly toward the floor, drowning in a tidal wave of sensory agony and public humiliation. Vivian stopped playing entirely. The silence from the piano bench was deafening. It broke the spell of the room. Every predatory eye snapped toward the human musician who had dared to halt the entertainment. Vivian didn't care. She stood up, smoothing the skirts of her simple black evening gown. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She was a fragile, mortal woman in a room full of ancient killers, but her anger was a stronger current than her fear. She knew what a sensory meltdown looked like, and she knew exactly how terrifying it felt to be entirely alone inside one's own mind, ignoring the warning glare of the event coordinator, and the dangerous narrow-eyed stare of King Alistair. Vivian stepped down from the dais. The heels of Vivian's shoes clicked softly against the marble, a steady metronomic sound in the oppressive quiet of the ballroom. She walked straight past Lord Dominic, not even granting him the dignity of a glance. When she reached Lysander, she didn't rush. She didn't crowd him. She stopped exactly 3 feet away, a respectful, calculated distance. She crouched down slowly so she was beneath his eye level, ensuring she wasn't a looming, intimidating figure. "Prince Lysander," Vivian said. Her voice was not a whisper, which could sound like hissing to immortal ears, but a low, even, and deeply resonant speaking tone. Lysander was trembling, his eyes tightly shut, his hands clamped over his ears. He let out another soft, distressed hum. "My name is Vivian," she continued, keeping her cadence perfectly steady, rhythmic and predictable. "I'm going to count to 4. On 4, I am going to tap the floor with my shoe. It will be a steady beat. 1, 2, 3, 4. She tapped her heel firmly against the marble. Lysander's breathing caught. He didn't open his eyes, but his head tilted infinitesimally toward the sound. 1, 2, 3, 4. She tapped again. The rhythmic, predictable repetition was an anchor in the chaotic sea of the ballroom. It was a mathematical certainty he could latch on to. Slowly, the frantic tapping of his fingers against his legs began to sync with the tempo Vivienne was counting. Dominic Rossi scoffed loudly from above them. "What is this human pet doing? Get back to your piano, girl, before I drain you for your insolence." Vivienne didn't break her rhythm, but she projected her voice just enough to carry. "I am establishing a baseline Lord Rossi. Something your rudimentary understanding of neurology clearly failed to grasp." A collective, sharp intake of breath echoed through the room. A human had just openly insulted a vampire lord. King Alistair took a sudden step forward, his eyes flashing crimson, but something held him back. He was watching his son. Lysander had slowly lowered his hands from his ears. He opened his eyes. They were unfocused at first, swimming with panic, but they eventually locked onto the steady, rhythmic tapping of Vivienne's shoe. "The environment is unstructured," Vivienne said gently, speaking directly to the floor so she wouldn't force agonizing eye contact upon him. "Chaos is painful, so we must create a structure, a parameter." She slowly extended one hand, palm up, keeping it entirely still. "I know a waltz," she said, her voice dropping to a softer melodic hum. "It is perfectly symmetrical, 3/4 time. No sudden shifts, no unexpected crescendo, just logic translated into motion. Would you permit me to guide you through it?" Lysander stared at her outstretched hand. He looked at the lines on her palm, tracing them with his eyes. The ballroom held its collective breath. The vampires expected the prince to flee, or worse, to lash out violently in a panic. Instead, Lysander did something that made King Alistair gasp aloud. With agonizing slowness, Lysander reached out. His skin, ice-cold and smooth as marble, met Vivienne's warm, pulsing hand. He didn't grip it. He simply let his fingers rest against hers, testing the sensory input. When she didn't flinch from his coldness, his grip solidified. Vivienne stood up smoothly, bringing him up with her. He towered over her, a magnificent, terrifying predator, yet he looked at her with an expression of profound, devastating relief. Vivienne looked over her shoulder, toward the string quartet that had been hired to accompany her piano playing. "Tchaikovsky," she ordered, her voice ringing with sudden, undeniable authority. "Waltz of the Flowers, strictly measured tempo. Do not deviate." The musicians, terrified, hastily raised their instruments. As the first structured, mathematically perfect notes of the waltz filled the room, Vivienne stepped into Lysander's space, gently placing his hand on her waist. 1, 2, 3, she murmured, guiding his first step. 1, 2, 3. Lysander was stiff for the first 8 bars. He was processing the friction of the floor, the pressure of her hand, the proximity of her heartbeat. But as the sheer logic of the waltz washed over him, a spectacular transformation occurred. The trembling stopped. The defensive posture melted away. Lysander Valerius was not broken. He was simply operating on a frequency the rest of his kind could not fathom. Once provided with a manageable, predictable framework, his immortal grace unleashed itself. He took the lead. It was like dancing with the wind itself. He moved with a devastating, impossible fluidity, his steps perfectly timed to the millisecond of the music. He guided Vivienne across the shattered glass of the dropped cup without her shoes ever touching a single shard. He twirled her with a gentle, terrifying strength that left her breathless, perfectly calculating her human weight and momentum to ensure she felt like she was flying. The sneers vanished from the faces of the immortal elite. They were replaced by stunned, slack-jawed silence. They were watching a masterclass in kinetic perfection. As they swept past the grand fireplace, Vivienne felt a strange static hum vibrating beneath Lysander's cold skin. It felt like standing near a massive electrical transformer. He leaned down, his lips brushing mere millimeters from her ear. He smelled of rain-washed pine and ancient frozen earth. When he spoke, his voice was not the broken, non-verbal sound they had all assumed he possessed. It was deep resonant and thrumming with an overwhelming, terrifying power. It was the voice of a king. "They think my mind is empty. Vivian." Lysander whispered his voice, vibrating directly into her bones. The cadence of his speech was slightly flat, highly formal, but flawlessly articulated. "They are wrong. It is entirely too full. I hear the stars shifting. I hear the blood rotting in Dominic's veins. I perceive the microscopic decay of this entire empire. It is so loud." Vivian shivered, not from fear, but from the sheer weight of the revelation. The twist hit her like a physical blow. Lysander's autism, his sensory overload, it wasn't a defect. It was the manifestation of a power so immense, so ancient and primordial, that it was literally breaking his immortal mind, trying to process it. He was a god trapped in a world of static, and the other vampires were too arrogant and ignorant to realize they were mocking the most powerful entity in the room. "I can filter the noise now," Lysander murmured, as he executed a flawless, sweeping turn that made Vivian's black skirt flare like ink in water. "Your heartbeat. It is a metronome. It is the only quiet thing in this world." Across the room, King Alistair watched, his crimson eyes wide with shock and a sudden dawning terror. He realized what Vivian had just unlocked, and in the shadows, Dominic Rossi's humiliation metastasized into a poisonous, lethal rage. The human had to die, and the broken heir had to be put down before the court realized he wasn't broken at all, but awakened. The final chord of the waltz echoed through the cavernous ballroom of the Astor estate, ringing against the imported crystal and fading into a suffocating silence. Vivian stepped back, slowly breaking her physical connection with Lysander. The instant her hand left his waist, she saw the shift. The terrifying, godlike stillness that had possessed him vanished. His shoulders hitched, his eyes darted rapidly toward the glittering chandeliers, and the frantic tap-tap-tap of his fingers against his thigh resumed. The overwhelming roar of the immortal world had rushed back in to fill the void her rhythm had temporarily banished. Before Vivian could speak, a blur of motion materialized between them. King Alistair stood there, his presence radiating an icy, ancient dread. "The performance is concluded." Alistair stated, his voice a lethal, perfectly modulated whisper that only she and Lysander were meant to hear. He did not look at his son. He looked at Vivian, his crimson eyes analyzing her with a mixture of suspicion and deep-seated fear. "You have earned your exorbitant fee, Miss Mercer. My security will escort you to your vehicle immediately." Vivian opened her mouth to protest, to say that Lysander needed an anchor, not a cage, but she was mortal, and the predatory stillness of the king was a stark reminder of her fragility. She gave a stiff, formal nod, gathered her sheet music, and allowed a towering security guard in a Brioni suit to lead her out of the estate and into the freezing Rhode Island night. As she sat in the back of the town car driving back to Manhattan, Vivian could not shake the feeling of the static hum beneath Lysander's skin. 3 days passed. Vivian returned to her structured, heavily disciplined life in a cramped, rent-controlled apartment in Morningside Heights, just a few subway stops from her rehearsal spaces at Juilliard. She tried to drown the memory of the Astor Gala in hours of practicing Chopin, but her mind kept replaying the flawless, terrifying mechanics of Lysander's waltz. On the 4th night, the temperature in her apartment plummeted so rapidly that her breath plumed in the air. Vivian froze on the piano bench. The security deadbolt on her door was still engaged, the chain untouched, but standing in the shadows by her modest bookshelf, illuminated only by the amber glow of the streetlights outside, was Prince Lysander. He was not wearing a stifling tuxedo tonight. He wore a heavy, ultra-soft cashmere sweater from Loro Piana and dark trousers clothing designed strictly for tactile comfort rather than aristocratic posturing. His hands were clamped over his ears, and his eyes were squeezed shut. Lysander 4. Vivian whispered, instinctively standing up. "The subway beneath this building." He ground out his voice, vibrating with strain. "It runs every 14 minutes. The friction of the metal wheels against the tracks. It screams. The electricity in your walls is a hive of wasps." Vivian didn't hesitate. She walked to the wall and unplugged the vintage refrigerator, silencing its low hum. She switched off the lamps, plunging the room into near darkness, and then stepped in front of him. 1, 2, 3, 4, she said softly, tapping her foot against the hardwood floor. Lysander exhaled a ragged breath, his shoulders dropping as he latched onto the auditory anchor. He slowly lowered his hands. When he opened his eyes, the frantic panic had subsided, replaced by an intense, overwhelming focus, directed solely at her. "You found me," she said, her heart hammering a rapid rhythm against her ribs. "I traced the specific acoustic signature of your heartbeat," Lysander replied, simply stepping into the meager light. "It is entirely unique. A perfect, uninterrupted staccato. It is the only sound in 4 centuries that has ever silenced the noise." He walked closer, his movements no longer jerky or defensive, but possessing that same impossible liquid grace he had displayed on the dance floor. "My father believes I am defective," Lysander said, his tone devoid of self-pity, calculating facts. "Dominic Rossi believes I am weak. They do not understand the lineage of the oracles." Vivian frowned. Oracles. An extinct bloodline. Lysander explained, his pale blue eyes pinning her in place. "We do not merely hear or see. We process the fundamental, subatomic friction of reality. I hear the decay of cells. I can calculate the trajectory of a falling leaf before it detaches from the branch. The sensory input is infinite. My mind built walls, the tapping, the rocking, the silence, to prevent my consciousness from shattering under the weight of omniscience." He reached out, hovering his cold fingers inches from her collarbone, tracing the rhythm of her pulse without touching her skin. "But you," he murmured, "your logic, your structure. When I focus on your tempo, I am not crushed by the universe. I command it." He finally met her eyes. "Dominic Rossi is coming for you, Vivian. I heard him plotting it 3 nights ago, whispering in a soundproof vault 5 miles away. He cannot attack me directly without invoking my father's wrath, so he intends to execute the mortal who humiliated him." Panic flared in Vivian's chest. "Then why did you wait 3 days to tell me?" "Because I was calculating the most mathematically advantageous location to slaughter him," Lysander replied, his voice chillingly calm. "And this apartment is not it. We need a larger stage." The Merkin Concert Hall near Lincoln Center was pitch black and supposedly locked for the night. Vivian had used her emergency key, a perk of her ongoing accompanying work, to let them in. The grand stage was empty, save for a single magnificent Steinway concert grand piano, played Leistu. Lysander ordered softly, standing in the center of the stage. He had shed his heavy sweater, wearing only a fitted black shirt that allowed for maximum kinetic mobility. "Do not stop playing no matter what you hear. Keep the tempo aggressive. Presto." Vivian scrambled onto the bench, her hands shaking as she poised them over the keys. She chose Rachmaninoff's Prelude, in C-sharp, minor, loud, heavy, and structured with brutal, unforgiving chords. She slammed her hands down the massive sound, exploding through the empty auditorium. Simultaneously, the heavy oak doors at the back of the hall splintered inward. Dominic Rossi strode down the center aisle, flanked by 6 heavily armed mercenaries. 3 were vampires, their eyes glowing with predatory malice. The other 3 were humans equipped with military-grade tactical gear, holding automatic weapons loaded with incendiary rounds. How romantic, Dominic sneered over the booming piano music, the broken freak and his human metronome waiting to die. Lysander did not flinch. He did not cover his ears. With Vivian hammering out the massive, thunderous chords of the Rachmaninoff, her structural bass line anchored him entirely. The chaotic noise of the incoming assassins, the clicking of rifle safeties, the rushing of immortal blood, the scuffing of combat boots, was no longer an overwhelming wave. It was a math equation, and Lysander was the master of the variables. "Take the girl first," Dominic ordered lazily. The 3 human mercenaries raised their rifles. Before their fingers could even depress the triggers, Lysander vanished. To Vivian, keeping her eyes locked on the keys as she played furiously, it looked as though the very air had fractured. Lysander didn't just move fast. He moved with omniscient precision. Because of his hyper-processing, he saw the physical vectors of their movements before they executed them. He didn't strike with rage. He struck with geometry. He materialized behind the first mercenary, his hand snapping the man's neck with a sharp, calculated twist that required minimal exertion. He used the falling body's momentum to pivot, sweeping the legs out from the second mercenary and crushing his windpipe with a single precise heel strike before he hit the floor. The third human managed to fire a burst, but Lysander had already anticipated the trajectory. He stepped perfectly between the bullets, grabbing the searing hot barrel of the rifle and driving the stock into the man's sternum, shattering it. 3 seconds. 3 bodies. Dominic's smug smile evaporated. "Kill him!" he shrieked to his immortal enforcers. The 3 vampires lunged, moving with supernatural speed. But against an oracle who was perfectly anchored, they were moving in slow motion. Vivian hit a massive ascending run of chords, her fingers flying over the ivory. Lysander moved in perfect time with her music. He ducked a decapitating strike from the first vampire, calculating the exact millimeter of clearance, and drove his hand directly through the creature's ribcage, crushing its heart. He spun, catching the second vampire by the throat. He didn't tear or rip. He applied specific, hyper-focused pressure to the spinal column, paralyzing the immortal instantly before tossing him aside like a broken doll. The third vampire hesitated, terror overriding his bloodlust. Lysander didn't give him a chance to retreat, severing his head with a single brutal strike of his bare hand. Dominic was backing away, his face a mask of absolute horror. The broken prince, the autistic heir who couldn't handle the sound of a clinking glass, was an apex predator of godlike proportions. You are a freak," Dominic stammered, his back hitting the auditorium doors. Lysander walked slowly down the aisle, his footsteps falling perfectly on the downbeats of Vivian's playing. He was spotless. Not a drop of blood marred his clothes. "I am an oracle," Lysander corrected his voice, a terrifying resonant boom that vibrated the very foundation of the hall. "My mind encompasses the cosmos, and you, Dominic, are nothing but an irritating, discordant note." Lysander reached him. Dominic hissed, baring his fangs in a desperate final strike, but Lysander simply reached out and gripped the sides of Dominic's head. "Let me share a fraction of my silence with you," Lysander whispered. He squeezed. The sickening crack of the immortal lord's skull fracturing echoed through the hall, a sharp counterpoint to Vivian's final resounding chord. Dominic's body crumbled to the floor instantly, turning to ash. The music stopped. Vivian sat breathless at the piano, her chest heaving, staring at the carnage. From the shadows of the upper balcony, a slow, solitary clapping resonated. King Alistair stepped into the dim emergency, lighting his face, pale, his eyes wide, with a mixture of awe and terror. He had followed Dominic, intending to stop the assassination, to avoid a political scandal, only to witness his defective son systematically dismantle a strike team with the power of an ancient god. Lysander, Alistair breathed, stepping down the stairs. You have healed. Lysander turned slowly, his pale blue eyes locking onto his father. He did not rock. He did not tap his fingers. He stood with the terrifying, imposing posture of a true sovereign. I was never sick, father, Lysander said coldly. I was evolving, and you abandoned me to the wolves because you were too blind to recognize the divine. Alistair stopped, instinctively lowering his head, recognizing the sheer, overwhelming power radiating from his son. The hierarchy of the East Coast had just shifted, violently, permanently. Lysander turned his back on the king, walking down the aisle and up the steps to the stage. He approached the piano, extending his hand toward Vivian. She looked at his cold, flawless skin, knowing exactly what he was: a weapon of mass destruction, a god of infinite sensory perception. She placed her warm, trembling hand in his. The world is still too loud, Lysander murmured, pulling her gently against his chest so she could feel the static hum of his power. But as long as I have your tempo, Vivienne, I will rule it. Did this breathtaking tale of defiance, ancient power, and unconventional love keep you on the edge of your seat? The shadows hide more than just monsters, they hide misunderstood kings. If you want more thrilling, dramatic stories, where the underdog shatters the entire world's expectations, hit that like button. Right now, share this video with your friends, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss our next epic romance.